Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are strapping in for what is perhaps the most intellectually demanding journey we've taken on this deep dive. And, maybe one of the most rewarding. We are plunging into the dense, conceptual world of Gilles Deleuze's magnum opus, Difference and Repetition.
Yeah, this isn't a book you can just, summarize in a minute or two. Deleuze's goal in this massive work, it's nothing less than to dismantle the fundamental presuppositions of 2 millennia of Western philosophy.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. He basically argues that philosophy has fundamentally misunderstood what thinking actually is. The source material you've provided is incredibly rich, and it forces us to trace this revolutionary movement across fields that seem totally separate.
Like what?
Well, you go from Plato's cave to the structure of the cogito, from Nietzsche back to the pure mathematics of Dedekind. It's all connected for him.
It sounds less like reading a philosophy text and more like, I don't know, navigating a conceptual labyrinth that changes shape as you move through it.
That's a great way to put it.
But here's our mission today. Deleuze makes this radical claim that genuine philosophical thought doesn't begin when we comfortably recognize a known truth or a category. Instead, it starts with a shock.
A violent one.
A violent, even painful encounter that forces us to create something new, to think beyond the limits of what we already know. So our challenge for you, listening, is to follow the trajectory of this non-linear thinker. We're going to move from what he critiques, the traditional restrictive image of thought, to what he actually constructs.
Which is a dynamic, creative ontology based on what he calls difference in itself. We're mapping the movement, not the logic. He explicitly rejects that kind of standard academic linearity.
In favor of what?
In favor of synthesis, movement, and pure creativity. If we do this right, you'll walk away understanding not just what Deleuze thinks, but how he thinks. How he builds these concepts designed to reject identity as primary and replace it with pure, affirmed difference. #tag1. The problematic, the encounter.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, with the rejection. If philosophy is supposed to start with a shocking encounter, what's the structure of thought that stops that shock from ever happening? What is this core enemy, this dogmatic image of thought?
The image of thought is, well, it's the established, deeply entrenched set of philosophical presuppositions that have governed Western philosophy since Plato, really.
But he really focuses on Kant, right?
He does. It reached its technical height in Kant. Fundamentally, it's the framework that legitimizes the idea that thought naturally, willingly, and, happily tends toward truth, unity, and the recognition of identity.
So it's the idea that thinking is easy, or at least that the mind is inherently well-disposed toward truth, like it has a built-in GPS for reality.
Precisely. The image presumes a natural, inherent affinity with the true in thought itself. It assumes a thinker has a good nature and a good will.
And what's the problem with that? It sounds nice.
Well, the problem, according to Deleuze, is that if thought already possesses this predisposition, if it's naturally good, then we would never need to be violently forced to think. Real thinking, in his view, just gets masked by comfortable recognition.
And this image, because it privileges that comfortable recognition, finding what we already know, it's directly responsible for what he calls the crucifixion of difference. How does that actually work? How is difference always made secondary?
It's done through a kind of structural subordination. Difference is never allowed to just exist on its own. It always has to be derived from or mediated by a prior established identity. And this subordination operates across 4 interlocking modes.
Okay.
He calls it the fourfold structure, and it's rooted really deep in Aristotelian and scholastic tradition.
So walk us through those 4 modes. How does this structure make sure difference is always, in second place?
Okay, so first, you have identity in the concept. This is your basic genus and species definition. When we define something, we place it within a larger identical class. The genus is the identity. The specific difference is the trait that separates it.
Got it.
That's the first level of subordination.
Right. So if I define a chair as a piece of furniture for one person to sit on, furniture is the identity, and the functional description is the difference. The identity of furniture comes first.
Exactly. Second, you have the mode of opposition of predicates. This deals with specific differences, like distinguishing rational from irrational or odd from even.
Okay.
These differences are always operating on a horizon of conceptual identity, like the genus number or animal. The opposition is specific, but it still relates back to a singular identity. There are differences that are conceptually manageable, you could say.
And the third mode?
Analogy and judgment. This is a bit more complex. It relates to metaphysics. Think of the way being is understood in many ways, but always with substance as the primary analogical reference point.
So substance is the most complete form of being.
Right. So when we say a quality or relation is, we always judge that is relative to the primary way of being, which is substance. So difference in this realm, how one category relates to another, is managed through this analogical scaling back to a primary identity.
Okay, so that keeps the entire field of metaphysics anchored to the concept of a singular, stable essence.
Precisely. And then finally, the fourth mode is resemblance in perception. This is where we deal with individual differences, like trying to tell one individual from another within the same species.
How do you distinguish Theaetetus from Socrates?
Exactly. Not through concepts, but by perceiving their resemblances to the shared species identity. These individual differences are considered infraconceptual, just existing via sensory perception of similarities.
So whether you are dealing with metaphysical categories, scientific species, or just, individual people, difference is never primary. It's always derived from, mediated by, or subordinated to a prior identity, a genus, or a resemblance. It's boxed in at every single level.
It is the ultimate restriction, and this entire system relies on what Deleuze calls common sense and good sense. These ideas underpin the image of thought by forcing a unification of all our mental capacities.
How so?
Common sense demands that separate mental faculties, sensation, memory, imagination, and thought, must all agree about the same object under a single, unified subject.
That sounds an awful lot like the Cartesian cogito, I think.
It is the cogito, but pushed to its absolute limit in Kantian critique. The philosophy of recognition demands agreement across these distinct faculties about the object in question.
So the object I sense must be the same one I remember, the same one I imagine, and the same one I categorize.
Yes, and on these separate branches of a single, unified cogito, difference is, in Deleuze's really severe metaphor, crucified.
And this is where we get the specific critique of Kantian reason. So Kant establishes this tribunal of critique and judgment. How does Deleuze argue that Kant, even with his revolutionary moves, ultimately fails to escape this dogmatic image?
Well, Kant's great move was to ask for the conditions of possible experience, right? Establishing a priori structures.
Right.
But Deleuze argues that Kant killed the old metaphysical God only to resurrect another form of identity, the subject, the I think, in order to save the world of representation. He does it by way of active synthesis.
Active synthesis.
For Kant, the subject is an active synthesizer, weaving sense data into a coherent world. Deleuze says this is still rooted in that presupposition of affinity. It assumes the faculties can and should agree. The subject is still the common denominator.
So the real problem is that Kant's approach stops us from asking a more fundamental question. What if the faculties don't agree? What if they're forced into discord by an encounter that just resists all categorization?
Precisely. And that takes us to the true starting point of Deleuze's own philosophy, forced thinking. Against that idea of a natural disposition, he argues that something in the world forces us to think. Thought is born not of easy recognition and agreement, but of a violent, painful, discordant encounter, a raw confrontation with the unthought. This encounter confronts the thinking faculty with its own impotence because it can't find the empirical category to recognize the object.
And that crisis.
That crisis forces a transcendent exercise of the faculty, driving it beyond its own limits.
So the ultimate philosophical problem then shifts entirely. It's no longer a problem of knowledge or recognition. It becomes a problem of genesis.
That is the pivotal transition. The goal is no longer Kant's project to state the universal conditions for possible experience. The goal is to provide a genetic account of real experience, the actual concrete process of becoming of the existing individual here and now.
How are things produced? How does the new emerge?
Exactly.
This shift is encapsulated in that intentionally contradictory term he uses, transcendental empiricism. Let's pause and define this key concept right here, because it seems to define the entire method.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Transcendental empiricism is Deleuze's own description of his philosophy. Its function, what it does, is it seeks the necessary conditions. That's the transcendental part, not of knowledge, but of real genesis. That's the empiricism part.
So it rejects transcendentals that are external to the world.
Yes, it insists on immanence and creativity. It's the framework for finding the conditions under which something new is produced, creativeness.
So what's the philosophical trap here? What's the common mistake people make with this term?
The trap is confusing it with classical empiricism, the sense data model, or with standard Kantianism. It completely inverts Kant's question. It asks, how is the subject human nature constituted within the given?
So the abstract concepts like the subject or the object or even the state, they don't explain reality.
No, they must themselves be explained as products of Genesis.
That makes the method profoundly anti-foundationalist. We're looking at conditions of creation, not conditions of possibility.
Exactly. The commitment is to the empirical real, the flux of existence. But we are looking for the pure, determined structures, the ideas that operate prior to and generate that empirical reality. That's the difference between his concept of the virtual and the possible, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Right.
But for now, just understand that the aim is not to rediscover the eternal or the universal, but to find the singular conditions under which the new is produced.
This philosophical posture, it sounds inherently aggressive toward established thought.
It is. The sources you provided make it really clear that the ethico-political mandate of this philosophy is not to serve power. Deleuze asserts that philosophy's utility is to be useful for harming stupidity, for turning stupidity into something shameful.
I love that.
Its only use is the exposure of all forms of baseness of thought and the demystification of the traditional image. It is an act of creation that requires a kind of critical aggression against all forces that restrict the ability to think something truly new. #2. The conceptual map replacing logical reconstruction.
Okay, we've established the critique. The traditional image of thought subordinates difference to identity. Now we move to the construction, the conceptual map that replaces that linear logic. This is where Deleuze really shines, weaving together sources from all over the place. Let's trace these four major intellectual movements within difference and repetition.
Right, so the foundation of Western philosophy is Plato's theory of forms, which established a very strict hierarchy. Deleuze begins his constructive project by performing what he calls an inverted or anti-Platonism.
Standard Platonism accepts the existence of the eternal ideal idea, say, justice, and then the good copies, the objects that participate in justice. But Plato famously managed the simulacrum.
And that's the crucial move. Plato's division established difference as a bifurcation, a gap between the eternal idea and its manifestations. The simulacrum is the dangerous demonic image, the bad copy that makes no claim to truth.
The one that has to be exiled to protect the purity of the idea.
Exactly. Deleuze reverses the hierarchy completely. He glorifies the reign of simulacra and reflections, including the infinity of copies.
And the champion of this inversion is the sophist.
Yes, the sophist is celebrated. The sophist is the one who raises everything to the level of the simulacrum, making it impossible to distinguish the accepted copy from the original model.
Okay.
And by dissolving that distinction between model and copy, the sophist utterly disrupts the hierarchy of representation. This is an ontological victory for difference.
Let's nail the definition of this concept then, because it's so counterintuitive. What is the simulacrum for Deleuze?
Okay, so the simulacrum is the image that operates without any reference to an original model or idea. Its function is to be unmediated difference. It's what enables his whole anti-Platonism project.
So the common philosophical trap is just mistaking it for a mere bad copy.
Exactly. The trap is confusing it with a simple error or a failure of representation, which is what Plato did. Deleuze elevates it to a positive ontological status. He says it's burdened with the superior form of everything that is. It stands on its own. Deleuze even states that everything, animal or being, assumes the status of simulacrum, and this defines a lived reality of a subrepresentative domain. This move immediately frees difference from ever having to refer back to an identity.
That's a radical start. If everything is the simulacrum, then difference is primary and pure.
Right. So if we have demolished the foundation of representation, that idea-copy hierarchy, we also have to demolish the subject that recognizes it, the unified Kantian cogito.
Okay.
Deleuze argues the self is not unified by an active I think, but it's produced by passive syntheses.
What are these passive syntheses, and how do they replace the active will of the subject?
The self, the I-self system, is generated first by the passive syntheses of habit. And habit isn't just a psychological routine. For him, it's contraction, a bodily expectation that unifies a series of experiences.
How does that work?
Our body is constantly contracting the future into the past to form a present. This contraction is a synthesis that happens before any conscious, active thought. Then you have the even more passive syntheses of memory, which are defined in relation to a pure past, which is the coexistence of all past moments.
So the self is a larval subject that never stops dividing or changing because it's just a constant site of these passive contractions and memories.
Precisely. It's a constantly fissuring, never unified system. And once the subject is shattered, time itself has to be restructured. Traditionally, time in Aristotle, for instance, was cyclical, subordinated to cosmic movement and change.
Right.
Deleuze follows Kant in arguing that time snaps out of this cyclical subordination to movement and it becomes a pure straight line.
You referred to this earlier as the true labyrinth, not the winding maze, but the terrifying straight line that just perpetually traverses the world. So time is no longer defined by what happens in it.
But everything else is subordinated to time. And that pure straight line is the framework for the static synthesis of time, which is constituted by the cut or the caesura.
And this is where the interdisciplinary synthesis becomes astonishingly detailed, pulling together Greek tragedy and pure mathematics.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Let's start with the effective side. Holderlin's use of the caesura in tragedy.
Holderlin, analyzing Sophocles' Oedipus, described the caesura as this moment of a pure, decisive cut, a fracture in the temporal flow. This is the subjective, painful moment that tears the image into unequal parts, distributing a non-symmetrical before and after.
And that shatters the subject's self.
Exactly. Oedipus's dissolved self. It's the pure present that produces a past and future in time that don't rhyme or resolve.
And this subjective experience of trauma and rupture is mirrored by the mathematical rigor of the Dedekind cut. This is where the synthesis moves into pure abstraction.
It is. Richard Dedekind was trying to define the continuity of real numbers purely arithmetically, without, relying on vague geometrical intuitions of a smooth line. A Dedekind cut, or Schnitt, rigorously divides all the points of a straight line into two non-empty classes, A and B, such that every point in A is to the left of every point in B. This cut determines precisely one point.
And the philosophical magic happens when that cut falls in a gap?
Yes. When the cut falls where no rational number exists, for instance, to define the square root of 2, which is irrational, it designates a gap in the rational number system that is filled only by the cut itself.
And Deleuze just co-opts this mathematical rigor.
He does. He sees this irrational cut as constituting a static and purely ideal definition of continuity. The cut is not a point in empirical time or mere pause. It's a transcendental condition, an ideal cause that organizes an infinitely ordered, discrete multiplicity of elements, which are the real numbers.
Let's define this concept of the cut then, because it's so central to his metaphysics of time.
Okay, so the caesura cut, which is the third synthesis of time, is the transcendental mechanism for time. Its function is to be the specific event or fracture that marks the production of pure linear time, separating the a priori ordered temporal series into a non-symmetrical before and after. It is the pure present.
And the trap, what's the mistake?
The trap is understanding the cut as a point in empirical time or just a pause in movement. It's not. It's a static synthesis or an ideal cause of continuity. It's a transcendental condition that he pulls directly from mathematical rigor. The linear time it produces is static, determined a priori, and it's not reliant on empirical flux.
So, as Deleuze says, the schema of cyclical time is substituted a time as straight line, marked by a caesura, which distributes a non-symmetrical before and after.
Exactly. The subjective trauma of the caesura from Holderlin and the mathematical rigor of the cut from Dedekind are synthesized to produce the transcendental form of time itself, which is the necessary condition for difference to emerge. It's an incredibly intense synthesis.
Okay, so having established the non-representative character of the world with simulacra and the structure of pure time with the caesura, Deleuze now has to clarify the conditions that actualize concrete beings.
Right, and he replaces the traditional substance-accident hierarchy with this tripartite ontological structure, virtual, intensive, and actual.
Let's start at the base, the structure of pure difference itself, the virtual idea.
The virtual idea is the fully determined, structured, and embryonic realm of reality. Its function is to be the plane of pre-individual ideas, and these are defined by differential relations and singular points. It is the genetic ground of the actual.
This is where he brings in Bergson, right?
Yes, he adopts Bergson's idea of the multiple as a substantive, replacing the whole one-many dialectic. Ideas are pure multiplicities.
Now, this is a concept that is extremely easy to confuse with potential or possible. We need to be very clear on this distinction.
Absolutely. The trap is confusing the virtual with the possible or the undetermined. The possible is just a shadowy reflection of the actual. It looks exactly like the actual, just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
The virtual, by contrast, is fully determined, highly structured, and it is real without being actual. It's a reservoir of singularities that require a force to push them into existence.
So the virtual is real, but not yet present in space and time. It's the differential structure underlying the actual world. How does that abstract reality become the concrete reality we experience?
That requires the second register. Intensity. Intensity constitutes the ground of the sensible, of all phenomena, and it is the necessary force for genesis. It is technically defined as the sufficient reason of the sensible and the form of individuation.
Give us a feel for intensity. What is it?
Intensity is grasped as differences of level, temperature, pressure, tension. It's the force that drives phase transitions. The moment you cross a thermal gradient or a pressure threshold, that is intensity at work.
And this brings us to the crucial contrast with extensity divisible, measurable quantities like length or area.
Yes, intensity and extensity define two fundamentally different kinds of quantity. The function of intensity is to be the non-divisible force that individuates matter. Extensity is the divisible, measurable space-time that results.
And there's a common trap here regarding intensity.
A huge one. The trap is treating intensity as merely a larger degree of extensity. For example, confusing 30 degrees of heat as just three 10-degree units added together.
Right.
Intensive quantities can't be divided without a change in kind. If you cut an extensive volume of water at 90 degrees in half, you get two halves at 90 degrees. But if you try to divide a process of individuation, say the pressure differential in a biological system, you destroy the intensive process itself.
And intensity is always trying to disappear, isn't it?
It is. Intensity tends to cancel itself out, or rush headlong into suicide, into uniformization, yielding to extension and quality. We experience the residual, measurable effects, the extensive heat, the visible quality, but the intensive difference itself is the force that collapses into the actual.
This process of moving from the virtual through the intensive to the actual is what Deleuze calls dramatization.
Dramatization is genesis itself. It moves from the virtual idea, those differential relations, through intensive morphogenetic processes to produce localized, individuated actual beings with extensive properties.
And this is where he brings in Simondon.
He cites Gilbert Simon in here, yeah, noting that the essential process of intensive quantities is individuation out of a pre-individual state, which he calls a reservoir of singularities. This is seen most clearly in embryology, where intense morphogenetic processes follow differential virtual multiplicities to produce the concretely existing individuated actual being.
So the complex individuated being is a product of forces intensity acting on structures, the virtual idea.
That's it.
Deleuze insists that his entire ontology of difference has to be one of affirmation. This stands in stark contrast to Hegelian philosophy, which really elevates negation and contradiction. Why is negation always secondary and psychological for Deleuze?
Because the world itself, for him, is composed of positive, productive differences. Negation is only ever a reaction or a psychological side effect of judgment, memory, and the imposition of limits.
How does he prove that ontologically?
He follows Bergson. If you are deprived of sensation, close your eyes, stop your ears, you never encounter nothing.
What do you encounter?
You merely experience the presence of your own organic sensations, the humming of your internal body, and the positive impression of the void you just made. You cannot sense nothingness because nothingness is not a positive feature of reality.
Negation, then, is an act of the mind, not a fact of the world.
Precisely. Negation refers only to the indeterminate whole of all that something is not. Genuine ontology has to start with affirmation. Hegel's dialectic subjugates difference to the negative negation, opposition, contradiction.
Right.
Deleuze argues that Hegel's method of infinite representation is fundamentally flawed because it begins with concepts that are way too abstract. He calls them baggy clothes. And it tries to reach the concrete by combining the inadequacy of one abstract concept with the inadequacy of its opposite.
So Deleuze offers a logic of inclusion, not exclusion.
A logic of affirmation. A finite form, say, an organism, doesn't exclude the universal form of life through negation, as Hegel would argue. Instead, it includes the full power of the élan vital virtually.
And ontology starts with the throw of the dice.
Which Deleuze equates with being itself, the chaosmos from which the cosmos emerges. We have to affirm not the specific outcome of one throw, but the entirety of chance itself. Ideas emerge out of imperative questions and the affirmation of this chance.
This philosophical move has immediate ethical consequences, which brings us to the surprising role of humor, illustrated by the binding of Isaac. How does Abraham's response to God's capricious command illustrate the affirmation of chance over moral law?
This is the ethico-ontological shift in action. Deleuze describes two ways to overturn moral law or representation. The first is assent, or irony, a critical reflection on first principles, which is what Kant and Hegel specialized in.
In the second.
The second, more radical way is to descend towards the consequences, submitting to the law with an all-too-perfect attention to detail.
The falsely submissive soul.
Yes. This soul uses humor to evade the law entirely, not by rejecting it, but by embracing the absurd consequences with such dedication that the moral law becomes irrelevant. Abraham, in this reading, affirms God's willful and capricious commandment, a divine throw of the dice, rather than appealing to a generalized, reasonable moral law.
He descends into the specific absurdity of the event.
Exactly. And that move, the humorous descent into consequence, is the ultimate affirmation of pure chance indifference over the restrictive logic of negation and universal law. It's an act of ontological freedom. #tag3. The concrete illustration in audio hooks.
Okay, Deleuze's concepts are profound, but they demand concrete illustration. Let's bring these abstract movements down to earth, starting with that intersection of mathematics and metaphysics we touched on earlier, the rigorous example of Dedekind cuts and irrational numbers.
Right. We established that Deleuze uses Dedekind's cuts, or Schnitt, to define the structure of pure linear time. Dedekind's achievement was to define the number line arithmetically, without relying on the vague, smooth intuition of movement.
He needed to account for every single point on the line, including the irrational ones.
Exactly. So when the cut falls on a rational number, it simply marks that point. But when the cut falls at a place like the square root of 2, it designates a gap that cannot be filled by any rational number in the system.
And this is Deleuze's key appropriation.
This is it. The irrational cut signifies an intensive depth or a pure difference. It is an ideal, static cause that organizes an infinitely ordered multiplicity of elements, the real numbers, thereby defining a time that is static, determined a priori, and not reliant on empirical flux. The cut is the difference that produces the continuity.
It's the unthought, the inexplicable, the virtual event that is made structurally visible.
Yes.
That mathematical rigor finds a remarkable, tangible parallel in the emergence of life and physical systems. Let's look at the real-world resonance in complex systems and embryology using that virtual, intensive, actual structure.
We can model any complex nonlinear system using this tripartite scheme. Let's consider a fluid, say oil or water, that we're about to heat uniformly from below, a process that leads to what's called Rayleigh-Benard convection.
So the initial potential parameters of the fluid, its viscosity, density, the thermal gradient, that represents the differential relations of the virtual idea. It's the determined, structured potential field for what could happen.
Correct. Then we introduce the force. The application of heat constitutes the intensive quantity. This is the morphogenetic process. This intensity isn't just an amount. It is a differential force, the temperature difference between the top and bottom of the fluid layer.
And as this intensity increases, it reaches a critical threshold.
And once that critical threshold, that specific temperature difference, is crossed, the system has to undergo a phase transition. It loses symmetry, and the intensive difference begins to actualize. The fluid spontaneously organizes itself into these complex, visible, large-scale convection current patterns.
Those hexagonal or striped cells you see?
Exactly. And the observable pattern, the specific size, shape, and stability of those convection cells, that is the actual entity.
So that resulting visible and measurable pattern is the extensive entity born directly from the intensive difference.
Yes. And this links immediately back to the biological examples Deleuze favored, especially embryology. The intense morphogenetic processes, the folding, the differentiation, the cellular migration, they follow differential virtual multiplicities, those pre-individual states, to produce the concretely existing, individuated actual being.
And this demonstrates what transcendental empiricism actually accomplishes, finding the necessary, structured, a priori conditions, the virtual and the intensive, for the real genesis of phenomena, which is the actual.
That's it.
I think this helps us finally grasp the full weight of the claim, that the philosopher, too, is simply a product of this process. The thinker isn't a unified subject, but a result of these passive syntheses and intensive cuts.
Exactly. The philosopher is the ultimate simulacrum. They are a system of the dissolved self, a kind of universal individual that has to be laden with stones, diamonds, plants, and animals, constantly dividing, enveloping, and enveloped, a larval subject whose function is to communicate the indeterminate as a positive function of determination.
Wow. Okay, before we conclude, let's leave our listener with some challenging, counterintuitive takeaways from this journey. These are the audio hooks that stick with you long after the deep dive ends, forcing you to question conventional wisdom.
All right, first, The true labyrinth is a straight line.
When time loses its comfortable cyclical structure, which subordinated time to movement, it doesn't simplify. Deleuze argues that it becomes a terrifying, complex, modern straight line that perpetually traverses the world, marked by that non-symmetrical, schizophrenic cut, the caesura. This is a far more demanding structure than any winding maze.
Second takeaway. Why negation is always secondary.
We proved that negation is not an ontological reality. If you are deprived of sensation, you never encounter nothing. You just experience the positive impression of the void you made and the presence of your own organic sensations.
Negation is merely a psychological side effect of memory and judgment. It refers only to the indeterminate whole of all that something is not. Genuine ontology must start with positive, productive affirmation.
And third, the philosopher as a simulacrum.
Forget the unified rational subject. The thinker, in Deleuze's view, is a system of the dissolved self, a constantly dividing larval subject that affirms the flux of pure difference.
This dissolved self, this system of swarming differences, is the true site where philosophical freedom is played out. Hashtag outro.
We began this deep dive with Deleuze's radical rejection of the image of thought, that presupposition that we think naturally and that difference is secondary to identity. We saw how he replaced comfortable recognition with painful genesis.
We mapped the trajectory, tracing the actualization of the virtual idea through intensive processes of individuation. And these are grounded in concepts drawn rigorously from mathematics, from tragedy, and from biology. This entire process affirmed pure difference, chance, and humor over the traditional logic of negation and opposition.
This philosophy offers not just a description of reality, but a demanding instruction manual for thinking differently. It's a challenge to break the dogmatic image and confront the chaotic, differential forces that compel creativity and the production of the new. This is the heart of transcendental empiricism.
And if we follow this thought to its final, most challenging conclusion, we return to the concept of death. Deleuze addresses death not as an ending imposed from the outside, but as an interior desire, a site where our freedom is played out precisely because the self has never fully recognized itself within the limits of the I. So what if freedom is achieved not in mastering the self, but in affirming its absolute dissolution? Deleuze describes death as the canceling out of large extensive difference and the liberation and swarming of little differences in intensity. This is the protest of the individual who refuses to be confined by the self.
What if the most profound freedom lies in affirming that swarming dissolution of the larval subject, allowing those little differences to finally play out? That is a tremendously provocative thought for you to carry forward. Thank you for providing the material for this rigorous exploration of difference and repetition.